July 17th, 1967, A Shau Valley, South Vietnam, 02:14 a.m. The jungle should have been roaring. Even at night, this valley never slept. Cicadas drilling the trees, distant artillery thumping like a heartbeat, rotor blades thudding somewhere far above the canopy as U.S. gunships prowled the darkness. But now, for the first time any man in Recon Team Raven could remember, the jungle sounded wrong. It sounded empty. Staff Sergeant Daniel Kehoe tightened the strap of his PRC-25 radio and glanced upward. The clouds were low, heavy, sagging like wet canvas over the valley. No moonlight, no shadows, nothing but a ceiling of darkness so thick it erased the sky. He wiped sweat from his chin. 2 minutes, he muttered. Private First Class Burns swallowed hard. "You sure we'll hear it coming, Sarge?" Kehoe didn't answer, because that was the whole point, wasn't it? Tonight was the first field test, unofficial, off books, whispered only through classified memos, of the aircraft the Pentagon had been calling Project CH Quiet. The men on the ground had heard dozens of terms: silent rotor, ghost bird, the invisible helicopter. No one really knew which name was real. They only knew one thing. The brass swore that this prototype helicopter could fly low over the jungle without making a sound. No blade slap, no engine thrum, no warning. Just the sudden appearance of American troops where no helicopter should have been able to insert them. Burns whispered, "If it's that quiet, how are we supposed to know it's here?" Kehoe scanned the tree line. "We'll feel the rotor wash," he replied, though even he wasn't confident. "You always feel rotor wash." But the air stayed still, too still. A faint smell of gun oil drifted between the men. Someone's hand tightened on an XM-16E1. Another soldier slid a finger along the edge of his KA bar, nervous habit. The jungle vines above swayed from something, wind, movement, then hung motionless again. A distant whoomp echoed off a ridge. Artillery from the firebase, normal. Then silence returned like a blanket smothering the world. Kehoe adjusted the radio again. "Raven 6, this is Raven Actual. Confirm inbound aircraft. Over." Static hissed. A long pause. Then a voice. Quiet, strained, uncertain. "Raven. Actual. Be advised, aircraft departed base on schedule. But telemetry is intermittent. You may not hear it. Repeat, you may not hear anything." Burns blinked. "Man, that's comforting." Kehoe didn't reply, because he was thinking something that none of the men wanted to say aloud. If they couldn't hear the helicopter, could they tell whether it was even under control? Above the canopy, the clouds trembled with distant thunder. A smell of ozone seeped into the humid air. The jungle floor pulsed with shadows as the men crouched, waiting for a machine no one had ever seen. Powered by a rotor system, engineers swore could rewrite the rules of covert warfare. The briefing had been short, the restrictions long, the warnings even longer. "Do not discuss the aircraft with any personnel outside your chain of command. Do not take photographs. If the airframe suffers a malfunction, secure the site and await retrieval teams." Malfunction. That word haunted Kehoe now. Somewhere far above, a shape might have been moving. Slow, predatory, gliding between cloud layers on a rotor system designed to cancel its own noise. The technology looked perfect on paper. Every engineer involved believed the future of infiltration lay in silence. But paper was one thing. Vietnam's mountains were another. A low vibration crawled into Kehoe's boots. He froze. The others felt it too. A tremor. A pulse, not a sound, just a faint pressure behind the ribs, the feeling you get when artillery is fired miles away, except this one was too steady, too precise. Kehoe whispered, "Eyes up." Branches rustled above them, but not from wind. Something was descending, something big. The men rose to a half-crouch, weapons angled down but ready. Burns shielded his eyes from falling debris. Another tremor rolled through the ground. Then, a crack. A metallic groan, a sudden violent shudder in the air. Kehoe's breath hitched. That wasn't normal. That wasn't controlled. And whatever it was right above their position. Before any of them could shout a warning, the vibrational pulse surged, sharper now, uneven, followed by a strange choking cough of machinery struggling against its own design. A catastrophic failure. Too high for safe descent. Too low for recovery. Kehoe shouted, "Move!" And in that split second, before metal screamed, before branches began snapping in rapid succession, the team realized the truth behind the Pentagon's whispered promises. The helicopter might have been designed to be silent, but failure was never silent. The canopy above them erupted. For a fraction of a heartbeat, there was no sound at all. Then the jungle ceiling exploded downward. Palm fronds tore like paper, branches snapped in rapid-fire bursts. A metallic shriek ripped through the darkness as something massive plummeted through the canopy, carving a violent path straight toward the waiting recon team. Kehoe dove sideways, rolling behind the trunk of a split bamboo cluster. Burns hit the ground flat, hands over his head. Two more men scrambled downslope, boots sliding in the mud. A shower of leaves, splinters, and shattered bark rained over them, the debris of a machine that should never have been airborne tonight. The final impact came like a hammer blow. Wham! The earth heaved, mud lifted, everything shook, then silence again. But this time it was a new kind of silence, the stunned vacuum that follows disaster. Even the insects stayed quiet, as though the entire valley were holding its breath. Kehoe pressed his cheek against the damp soil, letting the ringing fade from his ears. He waited for the sound of fire, of fuel igniting, of men screaming inside twisted metal. Instead, he heard only the slow drip of sap from a wounded tree trunk and the distant roll of thunder crawling across the mountains. Finally, he pushed himself up. "Status," he whispered. Hands rose from the darkness, thumbs, fists, gestures of survival. Burns crawled toward him, shaking leaves out of his hair. "Jesus Christ, Sarge! That thing came down right on top of us." Kehoe nodded. "Weapons up. Stay low. We move toward the crash." Because the rules were clear. If the prototype went down, the team had one job: find it, protect it, destroy it if necessary. No exceptions, no second chances. He clicked his flashlight once, then switched it off, a silent signal. The men fanned out in a staggered line as they advanced uphill toward the devastation zone. Saplings bent at impossible angles. The smell of torn vegetation was heavy, raw, thick enough to taste. Burns stepped on a length of twisted aluminum half buried in the dirt. It was no bigger than a rifle stock, curved, perforated with stress relief holes, a rotor component, but not from any helicopter he recognized. "Sarge, look at this," he whispered. Kehoe crouched beside it, tracing a finger along its deformed leading edge. The metal was lighter than expected, warmer too. "Composite blend," he muttered. "Same stuff they showed us at Nha Trang." He remembered the engineer's words during the classified briefing. "Our new rotor blade profile cancels the acoustic signature at specific RPM ranges. To the human ear, the aircraft will be effectively silent." But what the engineer didn't say, what only the project memos hinted at, was that the new blade geometry placed enormous stress on the hub assembly. At high torque, vibration built exponentially. And if resonance wasn't perfectly balanced, a single misalignment could tear the airframe apart. Up ahead, a faint glow flickered through the trees, not fire, more like an electrical arc struggling to stay alive. The men paused, exchanging glances. Burns whispered, "Is that the engine?" Kehoe motioned him to stay close and moved forward, pushing aside hanging vines until the ground abruptly leveled out. There it lay. The machine, what was left of it, rested in a violent cradle of collapsed trees. Its fuselage was shaped like a shrunken Huey, but sleeker, smoother, edges softened as if sculpted for minimum drag. The cockpit nose was crumpled inward, canopy shattered, glass spider-webbed across the wreck. Smoke curled lazily from a breached electronics bay. But what caught their eyes was the rotor, or what remained of it. The hub had fractured clean through its center. The blades, those experimental whisper-quiet marvels of modern engineering, were scattered like broken wings across the jungle floor. One blade was almost intact. It lay angled upward, embedded in a tree trunk. Its surface was a strange matte black, with curved geometry unlike any standard rotor design. No markings, no serial numbers. It absorbed light rather than reflected it. The silent rotor. Kehoe exhaled. Whatever this thing was supposed to be, it didn't want to fly. A muffled cough came from inside the fuselage. The men froze. Kehoe raised his fist. Silence. Hold position. Another cough, a groan. Movement. "Pilot's alive," Burns whispered. But something was wrong. The sound wasn't steady, it wasn't panicked, it was intermittent. Jerky, like someone drifting in and out of consciousness or struggling against a harness in a cockpit twisted around them. Kehoe moved first. He climbed onto the wreck as carefully as he could, boots slipping on mud-slick metal. He peered into the cockpit through a shattered panel. The pilot was slumped forward, helmet cracked, visor fogged. His hands were still on the cyclic and collective as though he had fought the controls until the very moment of impact. Kehoe tapped the helmet. "Sir, can you hear me?" The pilot's lips twitched. Then he whispered something. So faint, so fragile, Kehoe had to lean closer. Not vibration. Another breath. It was resonance. Before Kehoe could react, a rustling swept through the trees, not from wind, from movement, multiple shapes, fast, silent. Burns hissed, "Sarge, we've got company!" VC, drawn by the crash, moving in from the east, the worst possible timing. Kehoe lowered the pilot gently, then he lifted his rifle. "Circle up," he whispered. "We hold them off." But before he could give the next command, the electrical glow inside the wreck flared bright yellow, followed by a sharp cracking sound. Burns stared wide-eyed. "Sarge, what the hell is that?" A feedback pulse surged through the air, vibrating the earth beneath their boots. The silent rotor wasn't dead, not yet, and whatever systems were still alive inside that prototype, they were reacting to something. Something very close. The glow intensified, no longer a flicker, but a steady, unnatural radiance leaking from the ruptured electronics bay beneath the pilot's seat. Kehoe felt the hair on his arms rise. The air tasted metallic, charged, as if the jungle itself were holding a live wire. Burns took a step back. "Sarge, that thing's gonna blow!" But Kehoe knew better. This wasn't the signature of a fuel ignition. This was electrical, controlled, purposeful. "Back up," Kehoe said quietly. "But keep eyes on the tree line." VC silhouettes moved through the foliage, 3, maybe 4, closing in fast but cautious, advancing like hunters tracking wounded prey. The crash had brought them running. The glowing wreck was keeping them wary. A snapped twig rang sharp through the night. Burns swung his rifle. "Contact! Left!" Kehoe raised a hand. "Hold!" Because the enemy wasn't rushing them. They were watching, studying, waiting to see what the Americans would do with the downed aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the pilot released a weak groan. His fingers spasmed, brushing a toggle switch near the base of the panel. The glow immediately pulsed brighter, like a heartbeat reacting to pain. Kehoe leaned in just enough to see the cracked instrumentation. And for the first time, he understood what the pilot had tried to tell him. This machine wasn't designed to simply fly quietly. Its silence was a byproduct of something far more dangerous. A rotor system tuned to cancel noise through destructive interference by generating controlled resonance waves in the airframe. If the frequencies held, the aircraft was whisper quiet. If they shifted, by altitude, humidity, wind shear, the resonance could spiral out of control. It didn't just shake, it devoured itself. And now, with the rotors shattered, the resonance module was still running, hunting for balance it could no longer achieve. Burns whispered, "Sarge, it's reacting to something, but what?" The answer came as soon as Kehoe reached for the pilot's harness. The glow surged, rising to a sharp, keening pitch at the edge of human hearing, a pulse of electromagnetic feedback strong enough to rattle every metal object the men carried. Their dog tags buzzed. M16 receivers trembled. Even the radio on Kehoe's back vibrated with interference. The VC felt it too. Kehoe heard a muffled shout in Vietnamese. Fear, warning, confusion. A second later, one of the silhouettes darted forward, testing the American's focus. Burns raised his rifle, and the glow inside the wreck detonated into a blinding flash. Not fire, not heat. A shock wave of pure vibration. The ground rippled. Every tree trunk shivered. Kehoe felt it travel through his boots, into his legs, up his spine. The silent rotor's resonance module had triggered a failsafe, one designed to destabilize the rotor in an emergency stop, but never meant to activate while the aircraft lay broken on the ground. The wave of vibration erupted outward in a perfect radius. Branches snapped without wind. Leaves shook loose in a shimmering cloud. A distant VC fighter stumbled, clutching his ears as blood trickled from one nostril. Burns stared at the wreckage in horror. "Sarge, it's using itself as a weapon." Kehoe didn't want to confirm it, but he knew. The engineers were desperate for this machine to win funding. If the rotor worked, the Army would rewrite its infiltration doctrine overnight. If the rotor failed, they needed fallback systems, including one that could prevent enemy capture. Another pulse surged out, stronger this time, knocking a sapling flat. The pilot convulsed as the cockpit vibrated so violently the instrument panel tore loose from its mounting. Kehoe grabbed him. "We're getting you out of here." But the moment he touched the pilot's harness, the resonance module reacted. The glow flickered wildly, then solidified into a steady, deadly hum. Burns shouted, "Sarge! It's syncing with metal! Anything metal! Your radio's setting it off!" Kehoe dropped the pilot back into his seat, hating himself for it, and sprinted back from the fuselage, ducking behind an uprooted tree trunk as another wave blasted the clearing. The VC panicked now, retreating into the brush. They didn't know what the Americans had crashed into their valley, but they knew it wasn't natural. One of them fired a burst blindly. Rounds cracked overhead. Another pulse from the wreck sent the muzzle climb into the canopy. Kehoe crawled to Burns. "We need to shut it down." Burns stared at him. "You mean go inside? While it's doing that?" Kehoe wiped sweat from his chin, eyes fixed on the trembling fuselage. "We don't have a choice. If we don't kill it, it's going to light up this whole valley like a beacon. And if we do kill it, then the Army writes a report and pretends this thing never existed." Burns swallowed. "So, how do we shut it off?" Kehoe scanned the wreckage, reading the vibrations like a map. The pulses weren't random. They were directional. The machine was cycling through resonance bands, searching for balance in a system that could no longer achieve it. Which meant, there's a control cluster behind the cockpit. Auxiliary power. If we can cut that... The wreck shuddered again, sending another ring of shaken leaves swirling outward. Burns pointed at the glowing bay. "That thing?" Kehoe nodded. "That thing." And before either of them could decide who would risk approaching it, the pilot suddenly moved. His hand rose, trembling, and reached toward a red switch deeper inside the flickering cockpit. A final attempt to shut down the machine he had flown into the ground. Kehoe shouted, "Wait! Don't touch it!" But the pilot's fingers closed around the switch, and the jungle lit up in white. The flash ripped through the clearing, a burst so bright it bleached the world white for a heartbeat. Kehoe shielded his eyes, but the afterimage burned across his vision anyway, a silhouette of the pilot's hand gripping the red switch, frozen in an impossible stillness. Then the sound hit. Not a boom, not an explosion. A collapse. The air seemed to fold inward, sucking sound out of the jungle. The hum of insects died, gunfire cut off mid-echo. Even the rain clouds overhead seemed to muffle their distant thunder. The silent rotor's resonance system had entered its final failsafe. Burns grabbed the nearest tree trunk as the ground pitched under him, trembling in a deep subsonic roar that couldn't be heard so much as felt. Every bone rattling, every nerve vibrating like a tuning fork. Kehoe dropped flat, hands over his helmet. "Down! Down!" The pilot had triggered the resonance termination sequence, a procedure engineers had described as non-operational during the briefing, because in theory, no pilot would ever activate it at low altitude or with damaged blades or on foreign soil or while enemy forces closed in. But Vietnam didn't follow theory. The hum rose in frequency, not louder, just sharper, knifing through the air. The rotor remains shivered on the jungle floor. Each shattered blade thrummed like a plucked string. The trees themselves resonated, their trunks flexing in unnatural unison. Then a horrible metallic groan tore the night apart. The fuselage buckled inward, seams splitting, panels warping as if crushed by an invisible hand. Sparks spat from the glowing bay. The pilot convulsed in his harness, helmet slamming against the cracked canopy. Burns screamed over the vibration, "Sarge! It's gonna implode!" Kehoe wasn't sure implode was the right word. What he felt through his elbows, pressed hard into the shaking soil, wasn't the force of inward collapse. It was correction, a machine desperately trying to regain symmetry after catastrophic failure. The silent rotor wasn't dying. It was fighting, trying to restabilize its own resonance as if the blades were still attached, as if the airframe were still airborne, as if it could undo the crash by recalculating the frequency profile. The jungle shook harder. Branches snapped overhead. A chorus of terrified screams echoed from the tree line. VC driven back, stumbling blindly into the underbrush. Burns shouted, "We have to go! Kehoe, the whole valley's gonna hear this!" Kehoe raised his head. The cockpit glow flickered erratically, amber to white to deep, dangerous violet. That last color meant overload. He'd seen it once on an experimental radar set back at base. It meant one thing: thermal runaway. The resonance coils weren't just pulsing anymore, they were heating, fast. Kehoe forced himself up, crawling toward the wreck as it shook like a living thing. "The pilot's still inside! I'm not leaving him!" Burns grabbed his sleeve. "Sarge! You touch that fuselage, and it'll tear you apart like the blades!" Another pulse hammered outward. Mud rippled like water. A fallen M16 vibrated until its sling snapped. But Kehoe saw something Burns didn't. Through the smoke and the flickering light, the pilot was still conscious, barely. One trembling hand reached toward the canopy frame, searching for purchase. His visor was cracked open just enough that Kehoe could see his lips moving. Not random. Not delirious. He was speaking. To them. Kehoe cupped his hands around his mouth. "What are you trying to do?" The answer came as a weak rasp, barely audible between pulses. Backfeed, coil, overload. Burns frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Kehoe's stomach dropped. The pilot wasn't trying to save himself. He wasn't trying to shut the machine down. He was trying to sacrifice it. If the resonance coils fully overloaded, they'd fuse into slag. The machine would be ruined. Beyond recovery, beyond study, beyond enemy capture. "He's protecting the tech," Kehoe murmured. "He's following the final protocol." Burns shook his head in disbelief. "They'd rather kill their own pilot than let the VC get it?" Kehoe didn't answer, because both of them already knew the truth. Another pulse, another shock wave. The color inside the bay shifted to deep red, then purple again. The pilot strained against his harness, reaching for the exposed wiring cluster behind the red switch. His fingers brushed the sparking leads. A violent jolt hit him like a hammer, buckling his spine, arching his back in agony. Kehoe lunged forward instinctively, but the shockwave knocked him flat again. "Sarge!" Burns shouted. "You can't get close! It's using every metal source as a target!" And he was right. Even Kehoe's dog tags buzzed against his chest every time he tried to move. But the pilot turned his head, met Kehoe's eyes, and mouthed a single word: "Run!" Kehoe froze. He felt it then, a new sound buried under the others, a rising whine, high-pitched, continuous, not resonance anymore, heat, extreme heat. The coils were seconds away from catastrophic discharge. Burns grabbed Kehoe's shoulder. "Sarge! It's gonna melt down!" Kehoe finally gave the order he'd been denying the whole night. "Fall back! Now!" They turned to run, but the pilot pulled the last wire. A sound like ripping fabric tore through the clearing. The glow erupted into a column of white heat, and the silent rotor project, built to make helicopters invisible, announced its death with the brightest flash the A Shau Valley had ever seen. The blast wasn't a fireball. It wasn't shrapnel. It wasn't even an explosion in the way soldiers understood explosions. It was light, raw, blinding, white-hot light, followed by a concussive silence so total it felt like the entire valley had been erased. Kehoe felt himself lift off the ground, not thrown, lifted, as if gravity simply forgot its job for a second. Then the world slammed back into place, knocking the breath out of him as he hit the mud. Burns landed beside him, coughing, disoriented, groping for his rifle. "Sarge! Sarge! What the hell just happened?" Kehoe blinked rapidly, trying to clear the ghost image burned across his vision. The jungle swam in aftershocks of color. Leaves rained down like confetti. The earth itself still trembled with each fading pulse of residual vibration. No flames, no smoke columns, just the eerie glow of something that had died in a way machines weren't meant to die. Kehoe forced himself upright. "Head count!" Hands rose from the darkness, silhouettes crawling, staggering, shaken but alive. They'd been far enough when the final pulse detonated. The VC weren't so lucky. Shapes lay scattered along the tree line, men who had been closing in for the attack only minutes before, stunned, motionless, some groaning, some struggling to crawl, others not moving at all. Burns wiped dirt from his face. "Sarge, are we going to get hit again?" Kehoe steadied himself against a tree trunk, the bark still vibrating from the blast. "No. Whatever that machine had left, it used it." He turned toward the wreck. Where the silent rotor prototype had been was now a crater of twisted metal, glowing faintly red like volcanic rock. The air shimmered above it, hot enough that the leaves nearest the impact had curled into brittle black fans. Burns exhaled. That thing nuked itself. Kehoe shook his head slowly. No. It sterilized itself because that was the word the engineers used in the classified memo he'd glimpsed on a colonel's desk. Technology Sterilization Protocol, a process designed to destroy components beyond reconstruction if capture was imminent. And the pilot, God help him, had carried out that order with his own hands. Kehoe moved first, limping toward the crater. Burns followed. The ground around the wreckage hummed, a lingering vibration like the aftertaste of the resonance waves still clinging to the soil. Each step felt like walking across the skin of something alive, something unsettled, something that had not wanted to die quietly. The cockpit was gone, melted into an unrecognizable lump. No body, no remains, only fused metal, as if the pilot had been consumed by the device he tried to silence. Burns removed his helmet. Jesus, nobody's ever gonna believe this. Kehoe scanned the glowing debris. That's the idea. A crackle of radio static suddenly erupted from his PRC-25, loud, sharp, painful after the long silence. Raven. Actual, this is Raven 6. We lost telemetry. Give status. Repeat, give status. Over. Kehoe lifted the handset, still staring at the ruin. Raven 6. Aircraft compromised. 0 recovery possible. Hostile forces disrupted. Team... The radio spat a burst of static, feedback whining for a moment, still poisoned by the resonance. Kehoe waited, then finished. Team alive. Returning to extraction point. Burns looked around at the decimated clearing. What about the VC? Kehoe shook his head. They'll regroup, and they'll tell stories, but none of them will know what hit them. Burns kicked a curled piece of blackened metal. You think Command's gonna send investigators? Kehoe stared hard at the crater, at the molten silhouette of a helicopter that technically never existed. No, he said quietly. They'll bury this. Paperwork, classified archives, redacted lines. They'll pretend this was just another mechanical failure in bad country. Burns raised an eyebrow. And us? Kehoe slung the radio back over his shoulder. We'll pretend we heard a normal bird go down, and that's all. Because some secrets weren't meant for jungles, and some machines shouldn't survive their first night. The team began withdrawing, slipping back into the vines and darkness. Behind them, the crater glowed dimmer, the last pulse fading from the ground, swallowed by the valley that had always devoured its mysteries. Minutes passed as they moved, slow, cautious, silent. The jungle regained its voice, insects chirping, water dripping, leaves whispering with wind. It was as if the valley had exhaled again. Burns whispered, Sarge, what do you think they were really trying to build? Kehoe didn't answer right away. He looked back once more at the faint glow behind them, the grave of a machine designed to be invisible. And in that dim fading light, he finally said, a helicopter quiet enough to slip into any war, unnoticed. A pause. And a death loud enough that no one would ever find out how close they came. Dawn crept into A Shau Valley slowly, almost reluctantly, thin gray light seeping between the ridgelines, brushing the treetops with a cold metallic sheen. The jungle steamed as humidity lifted off leaves and soil. Birds returned, cautious at first, then louder, reclaiming the canopy. Recon Team Raven moved silently through the brush, following the narrow deer trail that wound toward their extraction ridge. Their boots sank into wet earth. Their sleeves were torn. Their eyes were hollow from the night's violence, but they were alive. And whatever they had witnessed hours before, Chacharyu was already disappearing behind them. Burns broke the silence first. Sarge, what are we supposed to tell the guys back at base? Kehoe stepped over a fallen log. Tell them what we always tell them. Burns frowned. Mechanical failure? Kehoe didn't turn around. Mechanical failure. The words felt wrong in his mouth, small, almost insulting, when he pictured the pilot's shaking hand pulling that final wire, the glow consuming the cockpit, the ground buckling under subsonic force. Nothing about last night felt mechanical. It felt like a warning. As they climbed the ridge, the jungle canopy parted just enough to reveal the valley floor. Kehoe paused, looking back. From this angle, the crater was invisible, just another patch of broken vegetation among thousands. The jungle healed quickly. It always did. Burns joined him. "Sarge, that pilot, he knew he wasn't getting out." Kehoe nodded. Burns swallowed. "Was it worth it? Losing the machine like that?" Kehoe finally looked at him, eyes steady. "We weren't ready for it. The country wasn't ready. Hell, maybe even the engineers weren't ready." He scanned the valley a final time. A helicopter that quiet would change more than tactics. It changes what war means, Burns exhaled. "Think they'll try again?" "Of course they will. The Army never quits a dream, just buries the failures and rewrites the budget." They resumed climbing. At the top of the ridge, Sergeant Kehoe keyed his radio. The static was softer now, still tinged with the lingering interference of the dead rotor, but fading, healing like the valley. "Raven 6. This is Raven Actual," Kehoe whispered. "Team approaching extraction LZ. No contact, over." A long pause, then a reply. "Copy. Raven Actual. Bird inbound." Burns smirked faintly. "A real bird this time?" Kehoe let out the first dry laugh he'd managed in hours. "Yeah, the loud kind." Minutes later, the unmistakable thump-thump-thump of UH-1 Huey blades rolled through the valley, solid, confident, unapologetically noisy. The sound felt primal, familiar, almost comforting. Burns nodded toward it. Music. Kehoe watched the Huey crest the tree line, its green and gray body glinting in the dawn. "Human," he said quietly. "It sounds human." They waved the pilot in. The Huey skids touched down, Raven team loaded up, each man taking a seat along the metal benches lining the interior. As the helicopter lifted, Kehoe looked through the open door, watching the clearing where the silent rotor had died vanish beneath a blanket of mist. Soon no one would know where the prototype fell, or why, or how close it came to rewriting an entire war. And when they landed back at the FOB, the debrief made it official: crash due to structural vibration. No salvageable components, enemy contact minimal. Pilot KIA, file sealed under restricted access. The project would not be mentioned in open channels again. The engineers would be reassigned. New proposals would replace old ones. The war would grind forward, bloody, deafening, chaotic, as though the Pentagon had never tried to make helicopters whisper. But somewhere, in a locked cabinet, in a windowless room with no name, a colonel would file a single-page summary. The classification stamp would read "Eyes Only." The subject line would read "Project CH Quiet, Evaluation Terminated." And in the final note, typed neatly, almost clinically, would be written: "Operational potential remains extreme. Technical instability catastrophic. Recommend suspension until resonance phenomena fully understood." Kehoe never saw the report. He never learned whether the pilot was commended or erased. He never flew over A Shau Valley again. But some nights, years later, long after the war had ended, he would dream of that moment in the jungle when the air itself stopped breathing. A machine built for silence, a death that roared without sound, a secret that vanished into the trees before history could catch it. And he would wake up remembering the one truth no report could bury. Some aircraft are never meant to fly, and some crashes are never meant to be found.